Well, hello and welcome to the One Church Library for Session 6 of Christianity 101, a session where we talk about the subject of rebellion. The subject of rebellion follows what we've talked about in terms of history that the Bible records. We walked through the story of Abraham, one of the key characters that God related to on a personal level. And then we heard the story of the nation of Israel as it was being formed, and as God, according to the Bible, delivered them from slavery in the nation of Egypt and brought them out and formed them into their own people, their own nation, that very nation that we know of today, and the nation that went on to go and to claim an area of the world, a section of land that is continually fought over even in the present day. Those two key historical events, the promise through Abraham, that God was going to change the world through him, and then the deliverance and the law given through Moses, those shape what comes and what frames our personal walk as well, and they help set us up for the subject of rebellion. The need that we are addressing today in talking about the subject of rebellion is that distance that we so often feel from God. Our big idea for today really is that the distance we feel from God is not a result of God's attitude or character, that it is actually a result of our rebellious acts. You see, in some ways, we're all rebels. I mean, think about it for just a moment. Think about when you were a teenager, growing up in your parents' house. Think about ways you rebelled at that age. Maybe adopting a hairstyle that your parents didn't approve of, getting a tattoo or a piercing that they would not have consented to you getting, but you did it anyway. Going places without their knowledge, or maybe telling them you're going to one place and going somewhere else. You see, in that age, rebellion kind of ekes out. We're all rebels in that respect, and I'm sure you have some funny stories and some interesting stories to tell about your rebellious days in that stage of life, as well as a few others. The big idea that we have to address first is the idea that the Bible is portraying as it walks us through this history, and that's the idea that everybody is a rebel. That everybody is a rebel. When you read the Bible, you get God's law, and you see God flesh that out into a million different circumstances and situations so that people had less questions about how to apply love your neighbor as yourself to their neighbors and to their lives. But shortly after that, you see that there are remedies for all of the problems and penalties for all of the things that violate the relationship, the values that God portrays to this nation of Israel. And when you get on through the Old Testament, what you see is that the nation continually rebels, and God continually just passes the penalty along to them. They are not close to Him. They are not being His blessing to the world, and so He pulls them from power and does things in hopes of getting them back, just the way that a parent spanks a child, not simply to stop the behavior, but to try to repair a relationship by changing behavior so that parent and child value the same things. That's where God takes the nation of Israel all through the remainder of the Old Testament. And at the very end, you see Him actually take them out of the land that He's blessed them with, because He has no other clear way of expressing the fact that they're just not on the same page anymore. And in a few key passages in the Old Testament that we have in our readings for this week, Nehemiah 9, Jeremiah 2, you can read through the nation when they hit moments, just blips on the radar, where they really do see the level of rebellion that they've pulled against God, and they just confess it. These whole chapters are actually filled with detailed accounts of how God has blessed the nation, and the nation has rebelled. How God has blessed the nation, and the nation has rebelled. It's true for the nation. It's also true for us. And I don't have to convince you of this. It's very, very easy to observe rebellion in our current present day. There are crimes everywhere. That's why we have a police force, firefighting teams, public servants to help us when people attack or do things that don't value the lives of other humans and the possessions of other people. So, kids are one of the best examples of this. If you have kids or you have neighbors who have kids, you can tell kids try to get away with things that they know their parents won't approve of. I mean, how many kids go to the refrigerator and try to sneak food out of a pantry, even though they know that mom and dad said, hey, it's not snack time yet, you can't have that, you're not allowed to eat ice cream, in the middle of the day. And kids are so funny because they will kind of quietly sneak along. It's obvious to us what they're doing, but they will try to, in their own minds, get away with something that is perfectly obvious to us what they're up to. So kids rebel, and adults rebel as well. I mean, what's that song? You hear it playing in the background? Yeah. That's a song that portrays this idea that we rebel. In fact, I think in many ways we are wired to rebel. In fact, that's what the Bible teaches. One of the most comforting things about all the collection of things in this collection of manuscripts called the Bible is in one of the letters from one of the guys who really was the main contributor to the New Testament, a guy named Paul, who got appointed as the leader of the church. He writes about his own personal struggle with wanting to rebel, even though he knows God, even though he's close to God, even though he's leading people to be close to God. He struggles because inside of him, he feels like there are two pieces that are pulling in different directions. One wanting him to go God's way, and the other one wanting him to go what he calls the sinful way. I want to read just a few words because I think you'll enjoy hearing this passage from his perspective, and that it may comfort you as it comforts me. He writes, "I do not understand the things I do. I do not do what I want to do. I do the things I hate. I want to do the things that are good, but I don't do them. I do not do the good things I want to do, but the bad things I don't want to do. So if I do things I don't want to do, then I am not the one doing them. Sin is living in me, and it does these things. So I've learned this rule. When I want to do good, evil is there with me. In my mind, I am happy with God's law, but I see another law at work in my body, which makes war against the law in my mind. The other law working in my body is the law of sin, and it makes me a prisoner. What a miserable man I am. Who will save me from this body of death?" Those are the words of Paul as he writes to a church in Rome. In the 7th chapter, he just goes into this tension that we feel. Because honestly, we are torn in two different directions. If you're honest with yourself, a lot of times you do something and then regret that you have done it. You give in to an impulse of the moment and then later regret that you've given in to that impulse. This is where addictive behaviors come from. This is where so many choices come from that are good for the short term but bad for the long term. And what Paul is saying is that tension is actually not supposed to be there. That in God's perfect world, it literally wouldn't be there. And that's what we're going to talk about today. We are all rebels, and I hope that you'll own that with me. But I want to give you some reasons why we struggle with rebellion and where it comes from. And the very first reason I can give you is this one that Paul illustrates, that there is something inside of us that really shouldn't be there that pulls us against God. We have a conscience pointing us in the right way, and yet we have a nature pulling us in the wrong way. When Adam messed up our world, when he sinned for the very first time, the Bible says that's where that tendency came from. That we enslaved ourselves from sin by rebelling against God. We put ourselves under Satan's authority, and Satan became ruler of this world when ultimately we were supposed to be the key figures, the key person in charge of the earth. And we call that in the Christian world the sinful nature. That every person is born with a sinful nature. That you don't have to teach your child to be selfish, to hit, to take away items, because they're literally born with a tendency inside of them to rebel. That's one of the reasons we rebel. There's another one that's very, very big that kind of goes along with this, and it's a lie that we get told when we go into rebellion. We think we're going to be the exception to the rule. And in the back of our minds, there's a little voice saying, "You'll get away with it. You can get away with it. They didn't, but you can get away with this. You can fly under the radar and make it." And so often, that's the lie we get told. As I was talking about with kids earlier, that's the lie they believe. They think no one is seeing them be sneaky, when it's completely and blatantly obvious to us that they're being sneaky. So, that they're trying to get away with something that they shouldn't get away with. Sometimes you can just look in their face and you can see the wheels turning, trying to formulate a plan to get away with what they want to get away with. That is the lie in the back of our mind saying that we can be the exception to the rule. And so often, as a friend once portrayed, this is like being at home and watching someone on television running away from the police. You know, you've got the helicopter shot of this car that's speeding down the highway with cop cars in hot pursuit, trying to get away. And in the back of that guy's mind, that song, Born to Be Wild, is playing. And they're thinking, I'm going to get away. There's going to be a curve. I'm going to do something that the police cars can't follow me, and I'm going to make it. Meanwhile, we sit at home in our chairs, kind of knowing that there's two possibilities that are about to happen. And we're eating popcorn and just enjoying the show because we know that the guy's either going to wreck and go running on foot and eventually get caught, or that he's going to die in some horrific crash. Because there really are two general outcomes that almost always happen when people rebel. They get caught now, or they suffer consequences and get caught later. But very, very few people actually manage to fly under the radar and get away with what they're trying to get away with. That's the blessing and the curse of rebellion, that there is a lie inside of us that says we can get away with it, when in reality, chances are we're not going to be the exception. We're not going to get away with it. There's one more aspect of rebellion that contributes to our struggle, and that is the fact that authorities appoint the rules, and that in our world, there are no perfect, trustworthy authority. This is what I would say is the most complicated matter, because we have parents who give us rules and then prove not to follow their own rules or prove not to be trustworthy enough for us to follow those rules. We have politicians who cheat and get caught, authority figures who abuse their authority, and in every respect, our trust is destroyed until we believe that God can't fully be trusted either. And that if we put our trust in Him and follow His rules, He's going to let us down, like our earthly families let us down. The biggest aspect of this really is our parents, because we live and breathe with them, we grow up with them, and they are, for a short period of time, ultimately trustworthy in our minds. And when they prove untrustworthy, especially our father figure, we have a real hard time believing that God is any different. The worst aspect of this is the one that Jesus railed against and railed against and railed against in His day, and that's religious authority. You see, people who are in rebellion try to calm their conscience so often by becoming more superior to the people around them. And in Jesus' day, there were a lot of people who were doing that with religion. They were pushing and pushing the brink to know more and to have more religious authority so that they felt like they could kind of quiet their conscience and feel like they were spiritual enough to overcome the deficit of the rebellious acts that they had done. And again, just like politicians and family members, religious leaders prove to be unworthy of the authority they've been entrusted with. They abuse us. They abuse the trust that they've been given. And ultimately, that not only makes us unwilling to trust the worship services that they're in charge of, but it makes us unwilling to think that God is more trustworthy than they are. So there are three common contributors to why we rebel. That authorities are not trustworthy, that we have this lie that says that we're going to get away with it, and that we are born with a nature that literally challenges us to rebel, and that fights us even when we are trying to do what's right. Now there's a comfort that though people do occasionally fly under the radar and get away with things, that they may not receive the perfect punishment that we feel like they should get in this life. That God has promised that one day, after everything is done in this world, He will sit down in a judgment seat. He will bring everyone into a courtroom, and He will make sure that they pay back all the things that they've done to you and to His justice system. And to some degree, that's very comforting, because when people break our trust, when they hurt us, when they violate justice and it impacts us, we want to see payment made. We want to see justice, and we will cry out for it and pursue it and do everything in our power to make sure that it happens. And so often, that's the one aspect that we can't let go of that ruins relationships for us. So God has promised to put everything right. And that is comforting when it comes to other people's rebellion. But it's not comforting in the respect that, again, everyone is a rebel. And that if they're going to get justice, that means that we will get justice as well. And we have to deal with the implications of both things. Because we really do want a perfect world. And if we're really going to get to a perfect world one day, well, God has got to set the record straight. And He's got to give perfect justice. He can't just let people off because He, quote-unquote, favors them above other people. You wouldn't want a God like that anyway. I mean, that's not a just God. And how can He create a just world if He's just playing favorites all the time? No, we want a God who does uphold justice fully. And yet, we know that that spells bad news for us. You see, the one problem we get wrong with God's justice system is we think it's different than ours. No, God's justice system is very much like ours. If you commit a crime, if you're a murderer, and you get put on trial, there's no amount of good behavior that can get you out of your sentence for murder. You are going to pay a penalty. That's just the way it is. That's the way it should be. And with God's justice system, it's very much the same way. It's not about good behavior versus bad behavior. There are no balancing scales in God's system. You can't do so much good that you outweigh the bad and thus get into heaven. And again, that wouldn't make us perfect people, and it wouldn't make for a perfect next world. So that really would be an inadequate way of doing things. So there are no balancing scales in God's system. You sit in a courtroom, God reads off your list of offenses, and you look at the penalty that involves. And unfortunately, for all of us, there's one penalty none of us can escape. Because ignoring God's laws is rebelling not only against a heavenly Father, but the rightful king and the rightful kingdom. And when you rebel against a king and a kingdom, they call that treason. And the payment for it is death. That's why when God gives the 10 Commandments, one of the next things you read is about bloodshed and animal sacrifice and how a life for a life type payment comes about. Because justice really does seem pretty grim for those who are treasonous. The sounding dull tone that we get to at the end of our subject of rebellion is that everyone is a rebel. Everyone's committed treason, and that God's justice system doesn't allow for good behavior to outweigh bad. And ultimately it shouldn't, because that's not going to make for a perfect world, and it's not going to satisfy us when it comes to seeking justice for the wrongs that have been done to us. Someone is going to have to pay. Someone's going to have to step in, and they're going to have to take on the sentence that we deserve. And when we get into next week in this person of Jesus, this incredible figure, who's not just a teacher, not just a religious sage, someone who came with a specific purpose, specifically related to satisfying God's justice, not changing it, paying the penalty. That's when we find relief and joy and a whole new perspective on life. And that's why this guy named Jesus has been a figure that has been wildly popular for well over the 2,000 years since he came. Our distance from God is not a consequence of God's attitude or his character. God truly is trustworthy, and his laws in many ways show that. The distance we feel from God is because of our rebellion. And our rebellion has a justice price that needs to be overcome. And there's good news in that regard. Good news we'll talk about next week.